Do you worry that RMDs could trigger tens of thousands in unnecessary taxes? As a financial planner, I've seen how the worst part isn't even the tax bill. It's finding out later you could have avoided it. So in this video, I'm going to show you whether RMDs are setting a tax trap for your retirement, how a Roth conversion can look smart and still become an expensive mistake, and the simple way to keep more of your money by paying less in taxes. So there are really two reasons people worry about RMDs. And until you know which one applies to you, it's impossible to know what to do next. For the first group, it's all about control. They look at RMDs and think, I don't want the IRS deciding when I have to take my own money. Now, the second group isn't as focused on control. They're worried about accidentally triggering taxes or penalties they didn't need to pay. And this distinction matters because each problem calls for a completely different solution. Let's start with the people who are worried about losing control. If you have money in a pre-tax IRA, RMDs start at 75 whether you like it or not. So if you want to stay in control, there's really only one way to do it. Move money out of pre-tax IRAs and into Roth or after-tax accounts. These aren't subject to RMDs, so the government can't force you to take money out. But before you rush into that strategy, there's one hidden trade-off most retirees never stop to consider. Let's say you have $1 million in an IRA and you have two choices. First, move all that money to Roth on your terms before you'd be subject to RMDs. But when you do this, it comes with a tax bill of $250,000. Now, the second option is you do nothing. You wait until RMDs force that money out on the government's terms. But when you do it this way, you only pay $150,000 in taxes. You lose control, but you keep an extra $100,000. See, no one wants to be told by the government when they have to take their money. But when the alternative is writing the IRS an extra $100,000 check, suddenly the government schedule doesn't sound so bad. So the real question isn't who controls when you take your money. It's whether RMDs will force you to pay taxes you never needed to pay. And if they will, what you can do about it. But before we dive deeper, let me give you a quick test to make sure RMDs deserve your attention in the first place. So if your IRAs and 401ks add up to less than $500,000, your RMDs will likely fit inside the 12% bracket. And that doesn't mean you should ignore tax planning, but it does mean your RMDs probably aren't going to create any major problems. It's once your IRAs get into the $750,000 or $1 million range that RMDs can start pushing you into higher tax brackets and higher Medicare premiums. But being in this group doesn't automatically mean your RMDs will be a problem, because two retirees could have the exact same RMD, and for one, it's a tax ambush, but for the other, it's just money they were going to spend anyway. So let me show you which one you are using two couples as an example. First are Mike and Lisa. When RMDs start, they're required to withdraw $150,000 from their IRA. And on top of that, they already have $75,000 in guaranteed income. So when you combine the two, that puts their income at $225,000. This pushes them just over the first Medicare IRMA tier and increases their premiums by $2,300 per year. At first glance, this looks like the exact situation every online article says you need to be worried about. But here's the part almost every one of those misses. Mike and Lisa own their primary home and just finally bought their dream lake house. So to support that lifestyle, they need $250,000 a year. And if they need $250,000 but only have $75,000 coming in from guaranteed income, then they already plan to withdraw $175,000 from their IRA anyway. So that $150,000 from the RMD isn't a tax ambush. It's just money they plan to spend anyways. And if you're sitting on a 7-figure IRA with big RMDs, paying a little more in Medicare premiums is a small price to pay if it means living the retirement you spent decades saving for. So the first question isn't whether your RMD increases your taxes or Medicare premiums. It's whether it forces you to take out more than you were already planning to spend. Because if you're already planning to spend that money, it doesn't matter that some of it came from an RMD. But what if your RMD really does force you to take out more than you plan to spend? Then what? Well, let's look at Jim and Diane so you can see what to do when this happens. They're 63 and have $2.5 million saved. $2 million is in IRAs and the rest is in brokerage accounts in Roth. Now, let's fast forward to 75 to see what their RMDs are and whether they'll be a problem. So at 75, they'll already have $120,000 coming in from Social Security and a pension. And on top of that, RMDs will force another $123,000 out, whether they need it or not. So let's compare how much they're forced to take to how much they'll actually need. In the last year before RMDs start, they need to take out about $90,000 to bridge the gap between income and expenses. But once RMDs kick in, now they'll be forced to take out $123,000, about $25,000 more than they need to cover spending. And as they get older, that number just keeps growing. So if Jim and Diane are being forced to withdraw more than they need, does that automatically mean they have an RMD problem? Well, remember, it isn't just about whether RMDs exceed your spending. The other half is whether those extra withdrawals trigger higher taxes, higher Medicare premiums, or other costs that never needed to happen. So let's switch over to Jim and Diane's Medicare bracket to see whether this is going to happen. This blue area shows their income, and these lines are the Medicare thresholds. Every time the blue crosses a line, their premiums go up, even though their coverage stays exactly the same. Early in retirement, they're nowhere close because they're spending from their brokerage account first and keeping income low. But once RMDs kick in, those withdrawals push them over the first Medicare threshold and eventually the second. So money they don't need is forcing them to pay tens of thousands more in Medicare premiums. And after seeing this, Jim and Diane assumed they needed to start Roth conversions now to avoid these costs later on. But luckily, before they did, they realized the entire RMD problem hinged on one assumption. So Jim and Diane's RMD isn't based on the value of their IRA today. It's based on the value 12 years from now. So to try and predict that value, we're assuming a 6% rate of return. And based on this, their RMD will be $25,000 more than what they need and push them into higher Medicare costs. But the problem is, nobody knows what their IRA will be worth 12 years from now. And there's no guarantee we'll even get 6%, especially with the run the market's been on. So let's lower it to 4% and see what happens. Well, instead of having an RMD that's $25,000 too much, they're now $12,000 short of covering their expenses. And they have to withdraw even more on top of their RMD. So at 4%, the RMD is just money they'd be spending anyways. And that's not the only thing that changes. At a 4% return, they're never pushed into higher Medicare costs. They stay well below the threshold for all of retirement. So just from one small change in their investment return, the entire RMD problem disappears. And investment returns aren't the only unknown assumption. They might spend more than we projected, leaving smaller IRAs in smaller RMDs. Tax brackets could change, and the same RMD could fit comfortably in a lower bracket. The point is, there are just too many moving pieces to know exactly what your RMDs will look like 12 years from now. So instead of asking, could my RMDs become a problem, ask, what has to happen before they do? But realizing this made Jim and Diane even more convinced they should start converting to Roth. If you don't know what's going to happen, why not move money now just to be safe? It's what every article and YouTube video says to do if RMDs might push you into a higher bracket later. But before you take that advice, you need to see the one hidden cost that almost nobody talks about. So the idea behind Roth conversions is simple. Pay taxes at a lower rate today so you can save money later. But the thing is, every conversion comes with a price tag, the tax bill that's due today. And the only reason you're willing to pay that price is because you believe you'll come out ahead later. But what many retirees miss is that you don't actually know what later looks like, right? You don't know what returns you'll get, what you'll spend, or what tax brackets will be. Which means every Roth conversion is really just a bet. You're betting that paying today's price will save you more tomorrow. So for Jim and Diane, does that bet actually pay off? Well, to answer that, this page is like a scoreboard for any tax strategy we want to test. Right now, we're assuming they don't do anything and just let RMDs happen. So let's add in Roth conversions up to the 22% bracket before RMDs start. We're following the advice you hear everywhere to move money at the lower bracket while you still can. But instead of saving the money, it actually results in over $17,000 more taxes paid. And they finish retirement with $87,000 less after taxes. So at a 4% rate of return, they lose that bet. They're paying a guaranteed cost today to avoid a problem that may never exist and losing money in the process. And that's why the mistake isn't failing to act on RMDs. It's making decisions you can't undo based on predictions you can't guarantee. But that also doesn't mean Jim and Diane can just ignore RMDs altogether, because there's one life event that can turn a manageable RMD into a tax avalanche overnight. So at the end of the day, Jim's biggest concern is making sure Diane is protected if something happens to him. So instead of assuming they both live to 90, let's see what happens if Jim passes away at 75. On the original projection, their RMD starts at $123,000 and only grows from there. And when we add in Jim passing at 75, the RMD itself doesn't change, but the consequences do. When we look at their tax projection, early on, their income sits comfortably inside the 22% bracket. But the moment Jim passes, Diane goes from filing jointly to filing as a single taxpayer. So the exact same income suddenly lands in a much smaller tax bracket. And within a few years, she's pushed all the way into the 32% bracket. But the consequences don't stop at taxes. When we switch this to Medicare premium brackets, they go from paying nothing extra to Diane jumping 3 tiers in costs. So on top of the grief of losing Jim, now she's paying a minimum of $5,000 more every year for the same Medicare coverage. And this is what's called the widow's trap. When one spouse passes away, the RMDs stay the same, but the brackets they need to fit in get cut in half. And the same RMD that was perfectly manageable can become a tax avalanche overnight. So the question is, how do you protect yourself without overcommitting to a future you can't predict? Well, the way to do this is what I call a regret-proof conversion. Here's what that looks like for Jim and Diane. So with the conversion strategy from before, if they only get a return of 4%, they end up paying $17,000 more in taxes than they needed to. And the problem with this strategy isn't that it's bad or irresponsible. It's that it only pays off under very specific conditions. And if their assumptions are wrong, converting up to the 22% bracket makes the cure worse than the disease. So to avoid this, let's dial it back and only go to the 12% bracket. That way, if they don't get good returns or things change, they didn't overcommit to a large conversion they can't take back. And after that one adjustment, now they're saving nearly $60,000 in taxes and end up with more after-tax wealth, even at a 4% return. And on top of this, if the future goes the other way, like the widow's trap, they still took action to help make sure Diane is protected. So that's what makes it a regret-proof conversion, because they won't regret the decision no matter which way the future goes. And here's what makes this even better. If they make smaller conversions for a few years and RMDs still look like a problem, they can just start converting a little more each year. Instead of locking in a 6-figure bet today, they're giving themselves more time and better information to ensure they make the right decision. So how do you apply this to your own situation? Well, before you start converting, you need to stress test your strategy under different assumptions like we did for Jim and Diane. And to do this, you need to be able to test different rates of return, conversion amounts, spending, and all the other assumptions that can affect your plan. And if you want to do this in a few clicks, instead of spending hours building spreadsheets, I'll include a link below for free access to this same software. It's the same one we use every day with clients and pay thousands of dollars a year for. Okay, so now that you know how to tell whether RMDs are really worth worrying about and how to keep them from costing you more than they should, the next step is making sure you don't overpay in taxes long before RMDs ever arrive. Because even if you never have an RMD problem, the wrong withdrawal strategy can still cause you to pay unnecessary taxes. So to see exactly how to structure your withdrawals so you don't pay $1 more in taxes than you need to, check out this next video.